I have studied financial crises for decades, and I can tell you that the next major deleveraging event will be significantly more severe than 2008. This is not speculation or fear-mongering. This is mathematical reality based on leverage levels, structural vulnerabilities, and policy constraints that did not exist during the last crisis. We did not solve the problems that caused 2008. We postponed them through massive monetary and fiscal intervention. Now those problems have compounded, and the tools that worked last time are either unavailable or will be far less effective. Understanding why requires understanding what actually happened in 2008 and what has happened since. The 2008 crisis was fundamentally a leverage crisis. Financial institutions, households, and some corporations had borrowed too much relative to their income and assets. When asset prices stopped rising and began falling, the mathematics of leverage turned vicious. Small declines in asset values created large losses relative to equity. Banks faced insolvency. Credit markets froze. The real economy collapsed as businesses could not access financing. The response was unprecedented. Central banks cut interest rates to zero and held them there for nearly a decade. They implemented quantitative easing, purchasing trillions of dollars in bonds to inject liquidity into the financial system. Governments ran massive fiscal deficits to support demand. These interventions prevented complete collapse and eventually allowed recovery, but they did not reduce leverage. They encouraged more of it by making borrowing cheaper than ever. Global debt today exceeds $315 trillion, roughly 65% higher than 2008 levels. This is not just government debt, though that has exploded. Corporate debt has reached record levels. Household debt in many countries has returned to or exceeded pre-crisis peaks. The financial system itself remains highly leveraged despite post-crisis regulations. We took a leverage crisis and solved it by adding more leverage. This only works as long as interest rates stay low and asset prices keep rising. When those conditions reverse, the consequences are amplified by the increased debt burden. Several categories of leverage particularly concern me. The first is zombie companies. These are businesses that cannot cover their interest expenses from operating profits. They survive only because ultra-low interest rates make debt service manageable and willing lenders keep refinancing them. Estimates suggest that 15 to 20% of publicly traded companies in developed markets qualify as zombies. In a normalized interest rate environment, these companies would be bankrupt. They consume capital and resources that could be deployed more productively, but they persist because the cost of money has been artificially suppressed. As interest rates have risen from 0 toward 5%, many zombie companies face impossible choices. They cannot refinance maturing debt at higher rates without becoming insolvent. They cannot grow their way out because their business models are fundamentally unprofitable. They cannot cut costs enough to become viable because their problems are structural, not operational. The only options are default, distressed restructuring, or being acquired for parts. This process has already begun and will accelerate as more debt matures at higher rates. Private equity represents another concentration of leverage risk. The private equity industry manages over $13 trillion, much of it in highly leveraged buyouts. The typical private equity acquisition involves borrowing 60 to 80% of the purchase price and using the acquired company's cash flows to service that debt. This works brilliantly when interest rates are low, asset prices are rising, and exit multiples remain high. It fails catastrophically when rates rise, growth slows, and exit markets freeze. Private equity firms raised massive amounts of capital during the low-rate era and deployed it into leveraged acquisitions at peak valuations. Many of these deals assumed interest rates would stay low indefinitely and that they could refinance or exit within a few years at higher valuations. Both assumptions are proving wrong. Interest costs have risen dramatically. Exit markets have contracted as public equity valuations fell and strategic buyers became cautious. Many private equity-owned companies are now trapped, unable to service debt at current rates and unable to exit at acceptable prices. The commercial real estate sector faces particularly acute stress. Office buildings lost enormous value as remote work reduced demand for space permanently. Occupancy rates in many major cities fell from 90% to 60% and have not recovered. Property values declined 30 to 40% in some markets. Yet most of these properties were purchased with significant leverage, and that debt remains on bank balance sheets at values that no longer reflect reality. Regional banks are especially exposed because they hold concentrated portfolios of commercial real estate loans. If these banks are forced to recognize losses by marking loans to current market values, many would face capital impairment. This creates a dangerous dynamic. Banks want to avoid recognizing losses, so they extend and pretend rolling over loans rather than forcing sales that would reveal true values. But this just delays the reckoning and prevents the market from clearing. Eventually, either property values recover enough to justify current loan balances, or banks must recognize losses. Given structural changes in office demand, recovery seems unlikely. Household leverage has returned to concerning levels in several countries. U.S. household debt reached record levels again, driven by mortgages, auto loans, and especially credit card debt. Credit card balances exceeded $1 trillion, and delinquency rates are rising as pandemic. Era savings have been exhausted and real wages have stagnated. Student loan debt exceeds $1.7 trillion, much of it held by borrowers with limited income prospects. This debt burden reduces consumption capacity and makes households vulnerable to any income disruption. Government debt deserves special attention because it constrains the policy response that rescued the system in 2008. The United States ran trillion-dollar deficits during the pandemic and continues running deficits approaching $2 trillion annually, despite being far from recession. Debt exceeds $35 trillion. Interest payments exceed $1 trillion annually, consuming a larger share of the budget than defense. Other developed nations face similar constraints. Japan's debt exceeds 250% of GDP. European nations violate their own fiscal rules regularly. This matters because in 2008, governments had fiscal space to run massive deficits without triggering debt crises. Today, that space has largely been exhausted. If another severe recession requires fiscal intervention on the scale of 2008 or the pandemic, debt levels would rise to territory historically associated with crisis and default. Bond markets may lose confidence in government creditworthiness. Interest rates could spike even as central banks try to suppress them. This would create impossible conditions where the solution to the crisis triggers a different crisis. Central banks face similar constraints. In 2008, they could cut rates from 5% to 0%, providing 500 basis points of stimulus. Today, rates start from 5% but are already causing stress at that level due to accumulated debt. Cutting back to 0% might be necessary but would reignite inflation concerns. Quantitative easing remains possible but has diminishing returns and carries political costs after years of criticism that it primarily benefits asset owners. The policy toolkit is not empty, but it is far less powerful than in 2008. The feedback loops between these vulnerabilities amplify systemic risk. When zombie companies default, they impose losses on banks and bondholders. If enough defaults occur simultaneously, financial institutions face capital stress. They respond by tightening credit conditions, which makes it harder for marginal borrowers to refinance, triggering more defaults. Commercial real estate losses hit regional banks, forcing them to pull back on lending to preserve capital, which reduces credit availability for businesses and households. This creates a vicious cycle where each round of deleveraging forces the next. Market liquidity has deteriorated significantly since 2008. Regulations designed to make banks safer have also made them less willing to hold inventory and provide market-making services. This means that when selling pressure emerges, bid-ask spreads widen dramatically, and prices can gap rather than adjusting smoothly. We saw glimpses of this during 2020 when even treasury markets, supposedly the most liquid in the world, experienced dysfunction that required emergency Federal Reserve intervention. In a true deleveraging crisis, liquidity could disappear entirely in certain markets, forcing distressed sellers to accept catastrophic losses. The international dimension adds complexity beyond 2008. Dollar-denominated debt outside the U.S. has grown enormously, particularly in emerging markets. When the dollar strengthens during crises, this debt becomes more expensive in local currency terms, triggering currency crises and sovereign defaults that feed back globally. China represents unique risk. China responded to 2008 with massive credit expansion that drove growth but created enormous leverage in property and local government. Major developers have defaulted, property sales collapsed, local governments, depending on land sales, face fiscal crisis. This is happening in the world's second largest economy with deep global linkages. The timing of the next crisis is impossible to predict precisely, but the conditions that typically precede deleveraging events are present. Interest rates have risen sharply from historic lows. Economic growth is slowing globally. Corporate profit margins face pressure from higher input costs and slowing demand. Asset valuations remain elevated relative to historical norms despite recent declines, which means there is room for further deterioration. Credit spreads are beginning to widen, indicating markets are pricing in higher default risk. What typically triggers the transition from unstable equilibrium to crisis is difficult to predict because it is often something unexpected that reveals vulnerabilities that were hidden during good times. In 2008, it was subprime mortgages, which seemed like a small corner of the financial system until their collapse revealed how interconnected and leveraged everything had become. This time, the trigger could be a sovereign debt crisis, a major private equity bankruptcy, a commercial real estate meltdown, or something we are not currently focused on. What matters is not the specific trigger, but the underlying fragility that allows a shock to propagate systemically. For individuals, understanding these dynamics is essential for protecting wealth. The conventional wisdom of buying assets with cheap leverage will prove disastrous if applied during deleveraging. Leverage amplifies returns in rising markets, but amplifies losses in falling markets. Defensive positioning requires liquidity. Cash gains value during deflation because everything else falls in price. Having capital to deploy when assets are genuinely cheap is more valuable than being fully invested when decline begins. Personal leverage should be minimized. Diversification across asset classes becomes critical as no single asset performs well throughout deleveraging. The duration of deleveraging events varies widely historically. Japan's deleveraging lasted 3 decades and arguably continues today. The U.S. deleveraging after 2008 lasted roughly 5 years before credit growth resumed. The difference depends largely on policy response and the starting point. Japan's government debt was already high in 1990, limiting fiscal options. The U.S. had more room in 2008. This time, most developed nations start from positions of extreme leverage, which suggests resolution will be slower and more painful than last time. The political implications of sustained deleveraging are profound and destabilizing. When large numbers of people see their wealth decline, their jobs disappear, and their prospects dim, they demand change. Incumbent governments lose elections, populism rises, scapegoating intensifies, policy becomes erratic as different approaches are tried and abandoned. International cooperation breaks down as countries prioritize domestic concerns. This creates feedback loops where political instability worsens economic conditions, which increases political instability. History shows that major deleveraging events often precede or coincide with geopolitical instability and conflict. The Great Depression preceded World War II. The 2008 crisis preceded a wave of populism and nationalism that continues today. When economic stress is severe and prolonged, the risk of governments making desperate or aggressive decisions to distract domestic populations increases. This is not deterministic, but it is a pattern worth recognizing. The next great deleveraging is not a possibility. It is a mathematical certainty given current leverage levels and the unsustainability of recent trends. The only questions are timing and magnitude. Those who recognize this and position accordingly will protect wealth and potentially profit from the opportunities that emerge during and after the crisis. Those who extrapolate recent experience into the indefinite future will face losses that could take decades to recover from. The warning signs are clear. The question is whether enough people will heed them before the crisis arrives.